All right, so this week we're in Paul's letter to the churches in Galatia, the churches in Galatia. Now, this is a great example of a letter that requires background understanding, or at least some digging in the text for implied background understanding. If you are just handed a Bible, right, and you have no idea how the Bible works, and you open up to Galatians, you're going to read it and just be like, man, this is some angry stuff. Right? Like, is this the stuff that's supposed to represent God? Now, it actually comes from a really loving place, but Paul is writing and he's angry. And so I think it's important, and this is, like I said, it's a great example of why it matters that we know that this is a letter written by a church leader to a bunch of new churches out of concern for them. So here's the background information. There was this big issue when the church first started. We saw this issue in the Ephesian church as well. The big question was, do people need to become Jewish in order to follow Jesus? Do they need to follow the law and be circumcised? If they're not Jewish, they need to first be Jewish, and then can they be in the church? And the answer is no. But there were some Jewish people that were like, yes. So Paul just really fights this, like pretty hard. So this letter is written because the people in these churches have left the message that he gave to them and have moved to this version. He says it's a different thing altogether. It's not just a distortion. It's not just a pollution. He calls it a different gospel altogether. So he starts out in the beginning. And he's like, I'm amazed that you're so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel. He sets this up and he's like, okay, you have deserted God. Not like, oh, you altered your beliefs. He's like, no. I'm shocked you have deserted the one who has called you, like in the grace, the favor, the love of Jesus. It's a big deal to him. Now, because this is such a big deal, and because he's so aggressively arguing, the whole first chapter, and even beyond that, is arguing for his credibility. So in the very first verse, he says, Paul, an apostle. And then my version, NASB, it's in parentheses. He's like, not sent from men, nor through human agency, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. It's like, my name is Paul, and God put me in this position, in case you're wondering if I can be trusted. So he's arguing for his credibility. Most of his letters have some kind of thanksgiving. In fact, most ancient letters have some kind of statement of gratitude in the beginning, like, oh, I love you so much, you're so great, you're doing such a good job. Hit this one, none. He's like, we're getting right into it, and he goes right after them. I'm amazed that you so quickly deserted God and turned to a totally different message. He says, if an angel or us or anyone else gives you a different message other than the one that is you're accepted in Jesus as you are where you are, and life change happens from trusting him through faith, other than that message, he's like, those people should be cursed. Now, he says this a few times, and he's not just trying to be mean and like curse them. He's referencing what Jesus came to do. So if you go back all the way back to Genesis in the very beginning, when things fall apart, right, we see that we're introduced to this curse, the brokenness of the human race. And a big part of what Jesus came to do is make all things new. And he reversed this curse. Like he became the curse to free us from this curse. Like he's healing us. And so what Paul is saying essentially is like, if you don't embrace the real message about Jesus, it has no effect. It's like the curse has not been touched. It's like it hasn't been reversed. So this is actually, it's like a hyperlink all the way back to the book of Genesis. And then he goes into his own story, which is powerful. You can read about it in the book of Acts. Paul was a Jewish teacher, and he hated the whole Jesus movement, and so he tried to destroy it. But then he met Jesus, and everything changed. So he goes into this and really unpacks it. He's like, you need to know that I met the man himself. The teaching I got from the source. And then he explains, you know my former way of life. He says, I was extremely zealous for the traditions, for my ancestral traditions. In other words, what he's saying is, if those people are going to argue that you've got to be circumcised and obey the law, he's like, at one point, I was so zealous, so excited about these things. If anyone would want that, it would be me. But I met Jesus, and he said no to all of that. And then he explains how he has this conversion, and eventually, he spends 3 years and doesn't talk to anybody. He doesn't consult with anyone about what happened to him. He just kind of like internalizes it, which I think is pretty interesting. A lot of times we just think Paul went to work right away. He did not. But then eventually he goes to Jerusalem. He meets Peter. It says here Cephas, that's Peter. And he stayed with him for 15 days. Eventually started to come out with this. And then word got out. Word got out that the guy who was trying to kill the church, crush the church, destroy the church, is now preaching the message, the faith he once tried to destroy. And he says, and they were glorifying God because of me. He's like, I have a reputation of being someone who is so into the Jewish stuff. And then all of a sudden, I started advancing the whole message of Jesus. And so he's going to go more into this in the next chapter, and we'll get into it tomorrow. But for today, look closely. Take a minute and look closely at verse 23. The man who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. And they were glorifying God because of me, he says. You know, I think a good takeaway for us today is that there's probably someone in your life that maybe you've written off when it comes to God and trusting Jesus. Like, oh, they're never going to be into church. They're never into this. It's just not them. If there was anyone that this was not for, it was Paul. He was actively trying to destroy it. And maybe that person in your life is not trying to destroy it. Maybe they're not an opponent of it. Maybe they're just not interested. Or maybe they give you a hard time about it. I don't know. But Paul's story is an important reminder that there is nobody who is impossible to get through to. There is nobody that is beyond the goodness of God. And so if there's someone in your life and you want to see change in them, keep doing what you're doing. Let your life be an example to them. And maybe at some point things will start to click, and maybe you'll be glorifying God because of the change you see in them. But stick with it. Don't quit on them. And stick with this. Tomorrow we're in chapter 2. So I'll see you then.